we have another guest who is a tenants' rights litigator, and she knows everything. She's from Chicago. The L&T game is her game over a decade. She secured the largest landlord-tenant mold class action settlement in the history of Illinois. Also, she just transitioned away from being the legal director of Open Communities at the nonprofit clinic that served thousands of tenants in Chicago fighting landlords. Please welcome in Miss Sheryl Ring.
Thank you so much for having me, Adrienne.
Thank you so much for joining me, because you know what, you know everything. You are a historian. I've known you for a while. I've loved you forever. And I'm so excited to have you here because the issue of evictions is really on people's radars now, where we know that some 23 million people nationwide are at risk of being evicted. And that's per the Aspen Institute. And you know what? People say they've never seen anything poised so significant in terms of the loss that will be out there for housing. How bad will this eviction issue actually be?
It depends on how willing we are to stop it. And it really is something that we have control over. One of the things that I tell people a lot about eviction statutes, every single one of them, all 50 of them, are Jim Crow laws. Most of them used to be called Forcible Entry and Detainer Acts. Forcible entry because it allows you to forcibly enter someone else's land, and detainer because then you can keep it. And we adopted this from the British common law. It was actually the laws that were originally passed to allow colonizers and settlers to take land away from indigenous people and keep it. And then it was repurposed after the Civil War to allow for white people to take the land of black sharecroppers and for white men to take the land of white widows. And so what you have is it's a law that was designed to target particularly women of color. And every year since then, we have evicted en masse women of color. Every year in the 21st century, we have evicted more than 1 million people. And in the entire 21st century, mainland Europe still hasn't evicted 1 million people combined. So the reality is we have the ability to stop this. This is not a crisis anywhere else that COVID has struck. And it is a crisis here only because our laws are written in such a way as to allow it to be one.
Wow, geez, that's mind blowing, especially the fact that it's essentially meant to and actually targets women of color. Me being one myself, it's not that awesome. But also too, we see that COVID, the ongoing pandemic, is targeting a lot of black and brown people. And the thought that they could potentially be unhoused in mass numbers amid this pandemic, I guess, is the reality and the thought here that it's actually going to end up, these evictions, it's actually gonna end up impacting more black and brown people?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at a book that Matthew Desmond wrote a few years ago called Evicted, or some of the studies that have been done in cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York City, San Francisco, overwhelmingly eviction statutes by design target black women and indigenous women, and Latinx people tend to be next right after that. And the result of that is that you have ghettos and slums. One of the reasons that we have housing segregation today is because an eviction doesn't come off your credit ever. It's not like a bankruptcy that comes off after 7 years. And even there's this urban legend that 3 years ago, the credit reporting agencies got together and removed evictions from credit reports. But really all they did was they created a separate agency so that they could collect more money from checking a different credit report to see if someone's been evicted. And one of the interesting things about people who do work like this, like I do, who have been representing tenants, is we have been arguing for years now, if and when there is a public health crisis. And what you're going to have is, instead of evictions forcing people into slums, because slumlords are the only landlords, predatory landlords are the only landlords who will rent to people with evictions on their record. If you have any kind of public health crisis, you're not going to be putting people in slums. You're not just going to be having segregation. You will have mass homelessness. But the problem is, this is not an issue that people in power think is problematic. Because if you look at the people who push back against eviction moratoria, it's not just landlords, it's also large banks and the for-profit prisons. And the reason that for-profit prison complexes push back against this is because the leading indicator about whether a young black man will go to prison is whether his mom was evicted. Because historically, according to the data, what will young men do if they see their mom is facing eviction? They're going to go and try and get money to get the rent paid. And so if you work for a for-profit prison, you want evictions to happen because this fuels your business. If you are a large bank, you want evictions to happen because it fuels your business. And so even where corporate landlords, even where small landlords stand to lose money as a result of this, the largest players in the economy, for the prison system, large banks, make money off of this. And that's why we haven't seen a large effort to push back against the coming eviction storm.
Wow, all right then. Oh, wow, that just blows my mind, as you do all the time. And to play devil's advocate, let's talk about these landlords. From a financial standpoint, I leverage my loans and I give out money as a bank, expecting a certain amount of return. And so if landlords don't get paid and then they can't pay their mortgage and so on and so forth, won't that be bad for the economy too?
Oh, it will be bad for the economy, but it's great for banks. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you look at how banking loans are set up for landlords, banks give out different kinds of mortgages for different kinds of borrowers. And increasingly what we're seeing in the industry is banks giving out predatory loans to landlords of color. If you remember the housing crisis, one of the things that large banks did was they preyed on the attempts of Black and brown families to build generational wealth through homeownership, through predatory loans. And now they're doing the same thing with respect to Black and brown landlords. So I have clients who I've seen where they have mortgages with an assignment of rents that requires them to pay the rent as it comes in to the bank in addition to payments. There are clauses that say that if at any point you are letting the property stay empty, you are not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to provide a rent break to your tenant because then the bank can default you. I've seen loans where the banks put in provisions that say that because you are doing this as a rental property, you are exempting yourself from the Consumer Fraud Act, from TILA, you're waiving usury laws, and these are targeted at either areas, it's a new kind of reverse redlining, either areas of a lot of Black and brown people or Black and brown landlords. And so a lot of landlords are put in this situation, even white landlords who rent property in Black and brown areas, where they can either lose the building by not accepting, by giving their tenant a break, or they can lose the building by giving the tenant a break and the bank comes in and takes it for lack of payment. And it always goes back to these large banks. And yes, there are a lot of landlords who are refusing to work with tenants just because they are slumlords. And this goes back to what I was talking about before with the looming public health crisis. But it's also very true that banks have set this up for a while as a new way to get money, because by the time a bank has filed a foreclosure, they've usually already recovered 3 or 4 times the amount of the loan through insurance, investments, and other payments.
Wow, oh my goodness. Well, it doesn't sound like we have that good of a future ahead of us. And Trump, I believe he said on Monday that if it comes to stopping evictions, he'll do it himself. And I'm sure we cannot expect him to do much of anything. But since we don't have that much time left, I'd love to also tap into your incredible side hustle, being a sports writer. And I know you love baseball. You write on baseball often. And unfortunately, we're seeing a number of teams, come down with that thing we call COVID-19 and the players and the problem. What do you see for MLB's future and how this COVID-19 situation should be handled, especially in light of the NBA bubble?
What's interesting about Major League Baseball, and I saw someone on Twitter mention this today, is how MLB is handling the pandemic really mirrors how the United States is. We're not going to do a bubble. We are just going to pretend everything is normal. And you can't it doesn't work that way. And I understand the need of people, and I get this myself, I'm a huge baseball fan, for that mental health, for the help with your mental health in the middle of a pandemic. But the reality is we cannot and should not pretend that what's going on right now is normal. When we have 23 to 28 million people facing eviction at this point, when we have about 30% of Americans last week couldn't afford their food. This is a real issue that we are facing. And I worry that what we are doing when we are playing sports, we are creating a distraction from the very real threats to our society. And so I wrote an article for Beyond the Box Score last week in which I argued that we shouldn't actually be watching baseball, because it just, first of all, it distracts from the very real problems that we're facing as a society right now. It is a way for us to pretend that things are normal when they're very not. And also because, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but with the number of players who are coming down with COVID, and it's not just the players, it's the bus drivers, it's the attendants, it's the hotel personnel, it's everybody who works in the lack of a bubble around baseball. Somebody's going to die. And what we are watching is people who are exposing themselves to a viral plague in slow motion. And there's a questionable morality about that.
Oh, absolutely. Questionable morality indeed, especially when it's largely probably to generate revenue, because I also don't really know how many people are watching baseball, but to each his own. Well, thank you so much, Sheryl, for coming on. Just kind of want to wrap this up by asking you where people can find you.
They can find me on Twitter at @ring_Sheryl, or email me Sheryl with an S, not a C, at SherylRingLaw.com.
You are fantastic. Thank you so much, Sheryl, for joining us, enlightening us, and entertaining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Adrienne.
The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.